Hey, Joe here. Thanks for visiting Road Trip Joe, and thank you for being my patron. You know, sometimes when you talk construction, you got to talk destruction. Today's video actually deals with politics. I know what you're saying. You're going, Joe, stay away from politics. And you're absolutely right. So today we're going to do that. We're going to get off the fence, and we're going to climb out on the proverbial limb and talk politics. I love metaphors. Politics, religion, that's just something you don't even discuss at Thanksgiving and Christmas. It's just not a good idea. And you're absolutely right. We're not going to talk politics today. We are going to talk about the Senate, and we're going to talk about the Electoral College. I'm not here to change anyone's mind about anything because I know that's not going to happen, and I respect your opinion anyway. But someone suggested something to me that got me to thinking. I have a friend who wants to abolish the Senate. Yes, the Senate, like the one in Washington, D.C. That's right, no more Ted Cruz, Dianne Feinstein, and no more Mitch McConnell. Actually, that sounds pretty good. But where would that leave us? My friend also wants the Electoral College to go away. You know, the one we dust off every 4 years to select our president? The one nobody really understands? So, no more Senate and no more Electoral College. But would we be a democratic republic anymore if we get rid of those systems? They've been around since like day one. Well, let's talk about how those two institutions came about. Okay, first let's cover the difference between a democracy and a democratic republic because that has a lot to do with how our system of government was designed. The key difference lies in the limits placed on government by law, which has implications for minority rights. Now, both a democracy and a republic use a representational system. In a republic, a constitution like ours protects certain inalienable rights that cannot be taken away by the government. In a democracy, the majority is not restrained in this way and can impose its will on the minority. In other words, in a pure democracy, the majority rules. Whoever or whatever party gets the most votes runs the show in a true democracy. In a republic, which is what was first established by the old guys who set all this up and is still around, the minority has a say-so too, which was deemed more equitable at the time. Actually, they didn't have a choice because a lot of states would not have joined the Union otherwise. And that's one of the reasons we have a Senate. The original purpose of the Senate was to give the states with smaller populations a voice in government. And the Electoral College, which was established in Article 2 of the Constitution, was set up for the same reason. And that's been around since 1787, although lots of amendments have been attached to it over the years. Now, if you look at the last 5 presidential elections, we've had 2 of the outcomes that would have changed if we just went by the popular vote. Al Gore in 2000 and Hillary Clinton in 2016. Both of them won the popular vote but lost in the Electoral College. This has happened 5 times actually, starting in 1824 with Andrew Jackson losing to John Quincy Adams. But Jackson came back and won in 1828 to square the match. But before we get to the Electoral College, let's talk about the Senate first, because their origins and establishment is really the fabric in how and why the Electoral College was first created. So, the Senate, just what is it they do? Well, they approve and ratify treaties, confirm presidential appointments, including Supreme Court justices and federal judges, and they conduct the trials for those presidents impeached by the House of Representatives. That is their main function, which is defined as an advice and consent body for the executive branch, the president. I like to think of them as a more refined group of people who don't wallow around in the mud fighting like they do in the House of Representatives. Well, they didn't used to. How did this come about, though? Well, back in the 1700s, states were considered to have sovereign rights. By that I mean each state was kind of like a country unto themselves, and we weren't really considered the United States of America before the Constitution. That's changed, obviously, with more federal intrusions, although states have retained some of their rights. But when our country first started, there were big states and little states just like there are today. And if everything was decided on just a popular vote, then the smaller states would have little or no say because they didn't have the populations of the big states. And this was very contentious back then, just like it is today. But at the end of the day, cooler heads prevail, and they came up with an equitable system that's worked so far, although some things have changed. Article 1 of the Constitution created the Senate, which gave the smaller states a say-so in a great many things. Originally, the senators were selected by their state's body of government, their legislature, to represent them at the federal level. Now, that part, the senators being selected by their state's legislative body, changed in 1913 with the passage of the 17th Amendment that said senators would be elected by their state's voters. I'm not going to go into how all this came about, but in the end, this was probably a good thing, as each state was probably represented in the Senate by whatever party controlled that particular state. Today we have states that have Democrats and Republicans and even independents as their senator, which is more equitable really. But there was one problem with these senators being selected by the state's voters. The senators today no longer represent their state as much as they represent their state's voter, which is a big difference in how all this was designed to work. Senators now are no different from those elected to the House of Representatives. Why is that? Well, because they aren't beholden to their state now as much as they are to the party they're in. They are elected politicians now, and they didn't used to be that way. And for that reason, Senate rules have changed over the years to reflect the party that controls that particular body of politicians. In other words, the Senate has become just like the House, which was not the intention of Article 1 in the Constitution. The Senate rules, which were always different in how they conducted business, are now very similar to the House rules. Whatever party is in power in the Senate can change the rules. The biggest difference is that it used to take 60% of the vote for approval to pass anything in the Senate. Now it's just a simple majority in most cases. The Senate was supposed to be part of the checks and balances that were to make sure everything ran smoothly as far as the separations of powers was concerned between the executive branch, Congress, and the Supreme Court. When my friend, who leans to the left by the way, sent me an internet link as to why they thought the Senate should go away, they sent me a link to a conservative website. Yep, that's right. Seems that both sides of the fence wants the Senate to go away. Even the Washington Post, a left-leaning publication, has had several of their journalists suggesting that the Senate should be dissolved too. So both sides of the opposite ends of the political spectrum are linking arms, it seems, which was news to me, although I found their reasoning kind of suspect. So what does the Senate have to do with the Electoral College? Well, plenty, and you should already know this one because it's the Senate that creates the imbalance in how many Electoral College votes there are. Each state starts out with 2 Electoral College votes, which is based on each state having 2 senators. 1 vote for each senator, although it's not the senator that actually votes. The people who cast the Electoral College votes are the citizens, just like you and me, who are selected on brownie points in most cases. The rest of the electoral votes, which there are 538, are based on how many representatives in the House a particular state has. Let's compare Wyoming to California, which are at the extremes of this argument and seems to be the example that most wanting all of this to go away use. Wyoming gets 3 Electoral College votes, 2 for their senators and 1 for their lone congressperson who just happens to be Liz Cheney. Man, how did she get in there? What a carpetbagger. So how many electoral votes a state gets is based on how many senators they have, which is 2, and how many House members they have, which in Wyoming's case is just 1, because they have a very small population, less than 1 million people, and that's all they get. Okay, that's 3 Electoral College votes for Wyoming, right? Doesn't sound like much when you compare it to California, which has 55. That's 2 for their senators and 53 more, 1 vote each for each one of their representatives in the House. The number of people a state has in the House of Representatives is based on their population, and California is much bigger, obviously. The rub here is that just because California has 3 votes, the numbers are way out of whack when comparing that to the representation in the Electoral College. Now, these figures are based on if everyone in the state voted, which they don't, but if they did, 1 elector in Wyoming represents 195,000 people. In California, that number for 1 elector is 712,000 people. So in Wyoming, one vote is like a 1/4 vote in California. That means the folks in Wyoming, like old Liz Cheney, are getting a lot more bang for their buck when it comes to the Electoral College. The District of Columbia, by the way, which is not a state, they get 3 electoral votes thanks to the 23rd Amendment, which was adopted in 1961. And that makes it even more out of whack, although D.C. doesn't usually vote the way Wyoming does. They actually kind of cancel each other out, really. All this makes sense? Probably not, I'm guessing. According to my friend and those who want it to go away, the Electoral College misrepresents every single state, with millions of votes having no representation in the process. Well, that's true. And no, that's not true because it's not by as much as you think. Wyoming and California are the extremes. But if you think about the effect having one electoral vote for each senator is worth, well, that's substantial. And that's some of the reasoning behind throwing out the Senate. I mean, 100 electoral votes out of 538 to begin with is nothing to snivel at. That's a little over 18% of the vote before we even have an election. And if you have a minority party as the majority in the Senate, then, well, there you have it. So yes, going by that calculation, I see their point. But is that a good reason to dissolve the Senate? Can you imagine what it would take to do that? Are we being realistic here? Can you see the House of Representatives voting on cabinet positions or Supreme Court justices? It's a madhouse in there. I mean, they represent all of us, and we are just one big mob, really. It's the majority that should rule, but the minority has to have a voice too, don't you think? At least that's what the architects of this republic tried to design. The framers of the Constitution gave future generations the ability to make changes, so maybe we should consider that first. There have been no changes to Electoral College in years. If it's broke, let's fix it. Unfortunately, that would take a new amendment with 2/3 of the states voting for the change. Not going to happen if you're from Wyoming, Montana, or Maine, trust me. But should we toss out the Electoral College because our candidate lost in the last election? I'm not sure we should be ready to throw the baby out with the bathwater just yet. Yes, 5 times in the history of the United States, someone was elected president without winning the popular vote. That means that 40 times it didn't happen. Democracy is hard, yes, and noisy and sometimes polarizing like it is now, but the big problem I see with Electoral College is that most states have a winner-take-all as far as electoral votes are concerned. That means if there's a low turnout in voting in a state, then it's possible that just 20% of a population in a particular state can decide where all of their delegates go. And that's a problem if you ask me. In this last election, Texas and Georgia were underrepresented in the Electoral College, but their votes cast were overrepresented. It was a winner-take-all in all those states. So with less than 40% of the population voting, they decided where 100% of their Electoral College votes wins. And that is not equitable. Why? Mainly because the losing side in those states gets no representation in the Electoral College. 3,877,000 people voted for Hillary Clinton in Texas, believe it or not, in 2016. But all of the Electoral College votes went to Trump. Well, almost all of them. Seems that Texas, which has 38 electoral votes, had 2 defectors who didn't cast their ballot for Trump. Doesn't happen often, but it did in 2016. They are called faithless electors. One vote went to John Kasich and the other for Congressman Ron Paul, who is actually retired. Go figure. Didn't cause much of a stir in Texas, obviously, and Trump still came away with 36 electoral votes in Texas. But over the course of history, 99% of electors vote with the popular vote of their state, so there hadn't been a constitutional crisis just yet over it. I don't know, but maybe a state's electoral vote should be based on their voter turnout, or probably just split the electoral votes, which makes more sense. According to the statistics, if states had split their electoral votes based on percentages this last election, then Clinton would have won by 1 electoral vote over Trump. That's right, just 1, even though she won the popular vote by almost 3 million votes. But don't cheer just yet, because she would not have gotten the required 270 electoral votes needed to be elected. All of those independent candidates would have gotten a slice of that electoral pie. And that would have thrown it into the House of Representatives to pick the president and the Senate to elect the vice president. And that actually has happened twice. The first time in 1800, and on the other in 1824 when Andrew Jackson lost to John Quincy Adams the first time around. But in this election, I think we know who the House would have selected. Granted, our system is not running real smooth right now, but I just knew that with all the checks and balances we have in our Constitution, all would be fine. Well, it's not fine. I'm just not quite ready to throw away the Senate because I see the beauty in what was created way back when. If I lived in a small state with a small population, I'm not sure I want California and New York and Texas and Florida dictating who the president's going to be every 4 years. But having said that, when someone wins the popular vote by almost 3 million votes like this last election, but loses the election, then I'm sorry, there is something wrong with that system. So let's fix it. Change the Senate rules back the way they were and make the Electoral College more representative of the population. To do that, you gotta have someone with a spine up there to push those changes. And that's what's missing, I'm afraid. Nobody up there has a spine. It's the House and the Senate and the Supreme Court who's supposed to protect us from the occasional nut job in the White House. So they all need to grow a spine. Okay, I hope you learned something new today, and I hope you go out and vote. It will still count, I promise you. So don't give up. That's all I got.
Belgian waffles, Belgian waffles, Belgian waffles. Splash in the coffee. Belgian waffles, Belgian waffles, Belgian waffles. Splash in the coffee.
Artichokes,
Artichokes-a-rooney,
broccoli,
broccoli-a-rooney,
gazpacho,
gazpacho-a-rooney.
Caesar salad and a crepe.
So I tore all the sheetrock out here. I'm sure it had asbestos in it. I think this house was built in the 50s or something like that. It's right on the coast of California, on the Central Coast. It's a nice big house. Today, this one I'm taking off. And as you can see, the siding's coming off with it. This used to be the outside of the house. Okay, well, he actually cleaned this out quite a bit. That's a lot of sheetrock. That's a lot of the sheetrock I pulled out. Not just a little, it was a lot. This whole room was full of sheetrock, boards, you name it. Oh yeah, remember that? Remember the wall? Yeah. Gone. Gone, 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 gone. It's all gone. Where do you see the ceiling, huh? Ceiling. Yeah. That's the ceiling. This is, yeah. That looks pretty torn up. Hey, Joe here. Joe.
Hey, this was a big improvise because I was...
Here we go, Bill. That's all I got. I'm dying.